بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على حبيبنا محمد الصادق الوعد الأمين المبعوث رحمة للعالمين وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين وعلى أصحابه الغر المحجلين ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين وعنا معهم برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وفقهنا إذا جهلنا وزدنا علما نافعا وعملا متقبلا يا كريم وبعد. We're looking at Hadith number 9 from the collection of the 40 Hadith that Imam Nawawi, the blessed Imam, the blessed scholar Imam Nawawi rahimahullah, he brought together 40 Hadith that give us the key meanings or the key principles of this religion. Hadith number 9 is about obedience to the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam and about avoiding going to excesses within religion. We'll repeat the hadith and then we'll continue looking at the points that we can take out of it. Abu Hurairah, whose name is Abdurrahman ibn Sakhr radhiallahu anhu, said, I heard the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam saying, whatever I have forbidden you from, abstain from it, and whatever I have ordered you to do, do as much of it as you are able, because those before you were ruined by their excessive questioning and their disagreements with their prophets. When we looked at this hadith gives us a number of key principles around which this religion is based. Amongst those key principles is absolute obedience to the Messenger of God. Absolute obedience to the Messenger of God. Anything that the Messenger of God has forbidden, whatever level of prohibition it is, whether it's an outright prohibition or whether it's something that he discouraged us to do, then the believer must always stay away from it. You have outright prohibition where there's a consequence if you fail or if you carry out that act. And those are the highest levels of prohibitions. Prohibition of drinking alcohol, of fornicating, of lying, of backbiting. This highest level of prohibition, if a person commits those acts, then that person will face the consequence either in this world or in the next world. But then you also have dislike prohibition, which is what we term in fiqh as karaha or makruh, where even though it's not categorically haram, it's not categorically forbidden, it's still something that you should try and avoid. Because even though, and this is where fiqh can get a bit too dangerous with some people, this is where legal rulings can get too dangerous. The idea that it's makruh, so therefore it's okay. We should rather see it as it's makruh, it's disliked by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so therefore it shouldn't be done. Just the fact, yes, there's no sin. If you did something that's makruh, there's no sin in that. But it's disliked by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's disliked by the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So we should always try and avoid it. So that's the first thing that this hadith touched upon. مَا نَهَيْتُكُمْ عَنْهُ فَاجْتَنِبُوهُ. Anything that I've forbidden you from doing, فَاجْتَنِبُوهُ. Avoid it. Avoid it means be as far away as possible from it. Not just haram. It's not just, I don't want you to do it, I don't want you to have anything to do with it. فَاجْتَنِبُوهُ. We also looked at a principle. This hadith gives us a lot of principles in this religion. What we term in Sharia, qawa'id fiqhiyya, principles of law. We also looked at this principle, which is based upon this hadith and it's also based on certain ayat in the Quran. The principle, ad-darurat tubihu al-mahdhurat. Necessity makes lawful prohibited acts. Necessity makes lawful prohibited acts. Whenever a person is in extreme difficulty, I see the hadith, in the words of the Prophet, he said, anything that I've forbidden you, fajtanibuh, stay away from it, avoid it, anything I've forbidden you. But then there's certain verses in the Quran that will indicate that in extreme cases, the prohibited becomes lawful, the haram becomes halal, and it may even fall into wajib. This principle, necessity legitimizes prohibited acts. In extreme cases, something that's haram becomes lawful for that person. Something that's haram becomes lawful for that person. is based upon ayah in the Quran. فَمَنِ اضْطُرَّ غَيْرَ بَاغٍ وَلَا عَادٍ فَلَا إِثْمَ عَلَيْهِ. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about the prohibition of eating certain types of meat like maita, carcass that's not been sacrificed lawfully, like pig, like pork, all these type of meats that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has told you that you're not allowed to touch. Then at the end in Surah Al-Baqarah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then says, فَمَنِ اضْطُرَّ, whoever is forced to do so. Whoever is forced to do so. In another ayah, it says, فِي مَخْمَصَةٍ, starving to death. Forced could be that compulsion, that there's some threat to you if you don't eat it. Or it could be that somebody's starving to death and he will die if he doesn't eat it. فَمَنِ اضْطُرَّ غَيْرَ بَاغٍ وَلَا عَادٍ فَلَا إِثْمَ عَلَيْهِ. Whoever is forced to do, who is compelled to do it, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says there's no sin upon him. There's no sin upon him. That's the basis of this principle. The hadith says anything that I've forbidden you, stay away from it. But now this ayah in the Quran is going to qualify it, meaning except for in extreme cases. All things that are haram, with one or two exceptions, there are one or two exceptions. All things that are haram, in times of extreme necessity, it becomes lawful. Bearing in mind, the Prophet ﷺ said in the hadith, مَا نَهَيْتُكُمْ, what I've forbidden you. And he ﷺ does not speak from himself. When he says what I've forbidden you, means what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has forbidden you. What Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has forbidden you. But then, if the Prophet ﷺ is saying, in this case, you're allowed to do it. You're allowed to do it. He ﷺ, or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the lawmaker. He decides what's halal and haram. He decides what's lawful and what's prohibited. It's the same one, subhanahu wa ta'ala. On the 29th and the 30th of Ramadan, He has told you that you cannot eat or drink. And you must fast. The very next day, He's told you, you cannot fast, you must eat or drink. You must eat and drink. On the day of Eid, it is haram for you to fast. It is forbidden for you to fast. The 30 days before that, it is fard upon you to fast. Who tells you for 30 days you can't eat and drink, and then the very next day you must eat and drink, and you don't have a choice in not eating and drinking? You must eat and drink. Who tells you that? It's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's His affair. It's His business. He has wisdoms in why He told you must not eat and drink, and He has a wisdom why in the very next day He tells you you can't fast. You must eat and drink. On the day of Eid, the day of celebration, you must eat and drink. So He's the one who's told you pork and dead meat that's electrocuted, meat that's stunned, and then the animal dies from that. He's the one, subhanahu wa ta'ala, who's told you it's haram for you to eat it. But He's the same one who's told you if you're dying, then it's fard upon you to eat it. It's fard upon you to eat it. Such that if a person is in that very case, is in a state of extreme necessity, if he refuses, knowing full well he can eat that, if he refuses, he's in a state of sin for refusing to eat. Because at that point, that's like drinking bread and water. That's like drinking water and eating bread. That pork, that alcohol, that's like drinking water and eating bread. It's become lawful for you. But it has to be extreme. It has to be extreme cases. So that hadith is now qualified. It's not absolute. Qualified, meaning except for in the case where a person is in extreme difficulty. But then, see, this principle, which can then be used in any case of extreme difficulty, and it doesn't even need to be very extreme, just where it causes difficulty. There are other examples of that. Based on the principle, any situation where a person is in extreme difficulty, haram becomes halal for him. As an example of that, food and drink is an example of that. An example of that, kashf al-awra, uncovering yourself in front of a doctor for a medical reason. You need medical treatment. A woman's given birth. She has to uncover herself. Her awra in front of a woman is navel to knee. She has to cover in front of other women navel to knee. But when she's given birth, the midwife is present there. She sees her completely uncovered. But those are necessities of life. There is no option but for that. At that point, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made lawful for her to uncover in front of those that she's not allowed to uncover. You need to go to the doctor. You may need to uncover certain parts that have to be covered. At a point where there's difficulty and you're not doing it, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made it lawful based upon this principle, that necessity makes lawful those things that are prohibited. Somebody is allowed to steal when he's starving and nobody's helping him. He's allowed to steal. The fuqaha mentioned as an example, the jurists mentioned as an example, if you're poor and you don't have food, you're starving, yourself and your family have no food, and your neighbour has, and he's got extra, he could help you, but he's not willing to do that. You're allowed to take that from him without his permission. You're allowed to take that from him without his permission. You don't need to ask him. Although that by definition is theft, but because of your extreme case, the extreme hardship that you're in, you're allowed to take that without asking him. The intention being that I need to survive. So anything in which there's an extreme case, it is permitted. The haram becomes halal. The one who said whatever I've forbidden you, avoid it, at this point now says you must carry it out. You must do it. Which shows you the lawmaker is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He decides what's halal and what's haram, not you. Not you. Even though you might find, pork, I'm dying, I'd rather die than touch pork. If you did that, you'd end up in hellfire. You'd end up in hellfire. As one of the students, I think of Sayyidah Aisha Masruq, he said if a person intentionally does that, he'll end up in hellfire. I can't touch pork. I'd rather die than touch pork. He refuses knowing that, he'll end up in hellfire on this principle of darurat tubihu al-mahdhurat. Necessity or extreme difficulty makes lawful what is prohibited. But then, see, people play around with religion too easily. People play around too easy with religion. Because then the question comes, what is a necessity? Like, if the Prophet ﷺ said, whatever I have made haram for you, avoid it. Whatever I've made haram for you, avoid it. But now the Quran is telling you in extreme cases you can do so. It's not for you and me just to randomly decide, okay, yes, the Prophet ﷺ said it's haram, but I find that a bit too hard to do, so it's okay for me. Just because it's a bit too difficult for me, it's okay for me. It's not for you and I just to randomly decide that I'm going to skip that one because I find it a bit too hard. And what does it mean by necessity and extreme hardship? They defined extreme hardship and necessity as something that will cause your life to be unbearable. Your life to be unbearable. Extreme difficulty, there's different levels. There's darurat, necessity, where it could result in you dying. It could result in you damaging some limbs, some physical harm come to you, and where life becomes unbearable for you. At that point, then one of his haram has become halal for you. But there's another level beneath that, which is al-hajat. Al-hajat is where it's not extreme, but life is becoming, it's not extreme hardship, but it's just becoming a bit rough. It's not, you can get through it, but it's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable. Even at that level, many of the fuqaha still stated that it's allowed. Haram becomes halal when it's not extreme difficulty, but there's difficulty within it. Where it's categorically not allowed and you can't play around with Sharia, you can't play around, is where it's just to make your life easy for you. Just to make your life easy for you. As an example now that we see, there are fuqaha, like interest is the example that they mention here. Interest is dealing with interest, with the banks and dealing with interest, categorically forbidden. One of the worst crimes a believer can ever commit. But now there are fuqaha, jurists who will say that a person needs to live in a property. So he needs to buy one so he can get one mortgage and that's it. Like, okay, there are some ulama who allow for that. It's disputed, but there are scholars who allow for it. But where did the second and the third and the fourth one come from? Where did that come from? And where's the Imam of the mosque going? Somebody used to, on Sunday, mention that the Imam's got 10 houses all on interest. And where can you justify necessity based on that? Just to make your life easier. Like, what's that now? Source of income for me. Source of income because I've got these other properties and I rent them out and make money out of it. Right? That's not somebody's dying. That's not somebody's dying. Another example could be that you've got a small property. It's not the best property in the world, but you just want to get a nicer, more comfortable house, more luxurious house. In the process of doing that, you need to go and take interest. There's no way in Sharia you can justify that. It may be slightly difficult for you, but it's manageable. It's not difficult. You're working a job, and your job, alhamdulillah, it's halal, there's nothing really, but you want to make a bit more money. But on the salary, you're on a decent salary, you're okay, you're not struggling, you're managing. But you now move into another job where there's direct haram involved in it. But you're now trying to justify it because I need a better salary. But you're living comfortably, you're living fine. There's no way you can justify it at that point. You cannot use that principle, necessity makes lawful the haram, just to make your life easier. Right? Another example, and this particularly applies to women, because this is something that came a couple of days ago. Taking student loans to go to university. Before, up until a couple of years ago, student loans was based on inflation. It was interest that was worked out on inflation. And that's lawful. That's lawful. Now it's just pure interest. It's a pure loan where an interest rate is set. The moment you take out that loan, interest is working on that one. So the sister comes and says, I need to study at university. I need to get a student loan. Am I allowed to as a necessity? Who said you need to study at university? Who said you need to study at university? You now have to justify to yourself before you go to any mufti, any scholar, to yourself, because you're going to have to justify to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You're doing something that will wage war against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You're waging war against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You best have a very good answer in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Just because I want a decent job. A woman, she's not the breadwinner. There's no legal requirement. She has to support her husband. It's her husband who's going to have to take care of her. So if anybody can argue, it's the husband who can argue. Because I need to take care of, a husband could potentially argue that because I haven't got a job, so I need to work a haram job. Because I need to take care of my family. He could argue that. But the wife, she's going out to work and she doesn't need to work. She can't argue that. So if she's now going to go and start going to university and taking out student loans and engaging in haram and so on, what justification is there? There has to be some real strong justification. So this principle, which is a key principle in Sharia, has to be understood in its context. It does not make haram halal except for in extreme cases where there's extreme difficulty or where life becomes uncomfortable. Then following on from that, another principle that's tied into this. The ayah in the Quran alludes towards this, or it states the principle. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, غَيْرَ بَاغٍ وَلَا عَادٍ. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَمَنِ اضْطُرَّ, he said, whoever is compelled, there's no sin upon him. He mentioned two things. On the condition, غَيْرَ بَاغٍ, that he doesn't want it. There should never be a desire in your heart to engage in haram. Even though Allah made it lawful for you, there should never be a desire within your heart to engage in haram. You should just recognize you're in a bad state that I need to deal with that. And whatever it is, whether it's interest, whether it's alcohol, whether it's having to expose your aura in front of a doctor, you should feel that there's an issue here, but Allah just made it easy for me because of the difficulty, but you should never feel easy about it. So Allah says, غَيْرَ بَاغٍ, he doesn't want it, وَلَا عَادٍ, nor should he go beyond what's acceptable. What's what? وَلَا عَادٍ. From this, the scholars have derived another principle. الضَّرُورَةُ تُقَدَّرُ بِقَدَرِهَا. Necessity is only allowed to the extent that it's needed. The example being the mortgage on properties. As we mentioned, there are ulama who say one property, and that's an opinion. And even though some may differ, it's an opinion. The scholars, and they're entitled to have their opinion. But if you're arguing necessity, where's the second, third and fourth one coming in? When they said biqadariha, according to the need, it means that you need a property for you to live in. To start getting the extra ones, for you to make money on it, you cannot justify that based on anything in the Quran and the Sunnah. You cannot justify it. That you're dealing with haram, don't feel comfortable with it. Just restrict it to the extent of your need. Like the example of awra being exposed. Your nakedness, you need to expose it to your in front of the doctor. What does that now mean? Just a part that needs to be uncovered and that's it. Just a part and nothing more than that, right? You know where it goes. Nothing more than that. It doesn't mean like his sister's in front of a male doctor because he's a specialist and she needs to be there. What's that now mean? She starts taking a scarf off. Like, she needs to be treated a particular. It does not allow for anything more than the area that needs to be exposed and that's it. It does not allow for anything more than that. It must be restricted to the extent. Another example of that, women who work in hospitals. There's a policy in hospitals that the forearms have to be uncovered. There is a valid opinion from Abu Hanifa that allows that the forearms are not awra. And that view is considered to be a necessity in times of difficulty. A woman can take that. She's working. She needs to expose her forearms. It's there. She can do that. But only where it's needed. Only where it's needed. So if she's working, she's a nurse, she's a doctor, she has to uncover her forearms at work, at the hospital. The moment she leaves and she's out in public, she has to cover it. بِقَدَرِهَا. Only to the extent that it's required. So that ayah gives us a second principle, which is based upon the hadith. Whatever I've forbidden you, avoid it. It's allowed. Whatever's been forbidden is allowed in case of extreme difficulty, but only as far or only to the extent that it's required and nothing more than that. Another example, they mention necessity or where, and this is something for people to think about, because people make up their own necessities and justify their own necessities. Categorically, the Prophet is forbidden sitting at a table where alcohol is drunk. Sitting at a table where alcohol is drunk. Being at a restaurant where alcohol is served is not necessarily haram, and that's a point of ikhtilaf. There are some scholars who take a more stricter opinion, say any restaurant where alcohol is served, haram to go in there. That's a more stricter opinion. Teachers that I took from, they said it's allowed provided it's not at your table and provided it's not the primary purpose. It's not like it's a pub or it's an off license. It's a restaurant where alcohol is served, provided it's not at your table, it's allowed. Now you're at work, and the work, there are meetings, there are parties that go on and so on. How are you going to justify that? How are you going to justify that? A work party, how are you going to justify that? I don't want to feel alienated at work. There's no way you can justify that. A meeting at work where people are drinking alcohol, that's for you now to start justifying that. Right? What's the extent of need? What's the extent of need for you to be involved in that? Bearing in mind the original statements of the Prophet, whatever I've forbidden you from, avoid it completely. And he forbade sitting at a table where alcohol is being drunk. He forbade sitting at a table where alcohol is being drunk. So if somebody sat at that table, you must have a real strong reason to be sat at that table. If you feel that I may lose my job because of this, that if I don't start engaging with non-Muslims who go out and they're having their meals, and I need to be there for progress to progress at work and so on, all of that, you must have some real good justification with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in order for that to be acceptable. So that's a second point with this hadith. A second point to understand with this hadith, just going back, the desire to have a comfortable lifestyle does not fall into the category of need. Thus a person who works in a job that involves dealing with haram is allowed to do so, but that's if there's a necessity. That's if there's a necessity. And often with women, and this is not about man and woman, this is about necessity and need. The man has been legally required to provide for his family. And in Sharia, if Muslims lived as they're required to, and they don't, but if they live as they're required to, a woman should never ever have to work. Should never ever have to work. Right? At one level, even up to she's an adult, she's not married, her father has to take care of her. Her father has to take care of her. She's married a husband. She's not married, no father, no husband, then it'll be her grandfather, her brother, her uncle. There's somebody who's required to take care of her. But because these systems are broken down, the extended family structure is broken down, where part of the honor of a man is that you take care of your family. You take care of your family, then people are compelled into doing so. Wallahu a'lam. We're going to stop for Maghrib. Are there any questions? We'll continue after Maghrib, but are there any questions on what's been mentioned so far? Yeah, Tahir.
You mentioned the issue with the buying more property.
Yeah.
Are there sort of stipulations on that one property? Is it like a 3-bed house too much for a couple, or do you have to
For sure, for sure. Yeah, they should be. That should all be considered.
where would you draw that line?
That becomes a very detailed point. Well, on the same principle, this is for those scholars who justify that. Those scholars who, and as we mentioned, it's a valid opinion. It's there among some scholars, but it's not to buy a luxurious property. It's just to have a place to live. It's to have a place to live, and that's it. A place to live that's of a suitable standard, urfan, as considered by people. That's or in that community, in that society, what's considered suitable. But to go beyond that, there's definitely no permissibility within that. Allahu A'lam. Amr?
Well, what about these things like halal mortgages and halal finances?
They don't look very halal. They don't look very halal. It's halal mortgages, halal finances, so on. See the problem with it, there are fatwas that allow it. The only one that's doing it right now is, it's called Rayyan now, isn't it? Rayyan. It used to be Islamic Bank of Britain. But it's a way of working the system so that the end result is exactly the same. Right? As far as the bank's concerned, it's getting its interest. For them, Sharia, there are ways of justifying it. But what happens is when you work through the system controls, not you. Not you, the system controls. So they're going to get exactly what they're getting. They're not going to lose anything else. But provided it matches, even though the contract is structured differently, provided it matches up with what's acceptable in Islam, then despite the fact the outcome may be exactly the same, it's lawful. To say it's the best option is far from the best. And it can be justified as long as it's structured in a manner where where the haram has been eliminated, even though the result is the same, even though the bank's getting exactly the same amount of money. So for example, they change the interest into rental payments. They're getting exactly the same. That's valid. That's valid. So it's playing with this. It's
playing the system basically.
It is, and it's not ideal. It's not ideal, but inshallah.
Shaykh, you mentioned it's not permissible to sit at a table where alcohol is being drunk. What about food that's not allowed? Is it the same ruling with that as well?
No, particularly the Prophet ﷺ forbade alcohol. He made a particular point about alcohol. It's still better to avoid, but alcohol was was particular, and the Prophet ﷺ, when he spoke about alcohol, he listed many prohibitions connected, like carrying it to the table, serving it. He mentioned many different things connected to alcohol. And that's because he said, he referred to it as Khaba'ith. It's the cause of all evil. And the second part of the hadith, so the points that we looked at so far, I've looked at the first part of the hadith. Whatever I've forbidden you from doing, avoid it. The second part is al-amr. The first part is nahi, prohibition. The second part is al-amr, is the order. وَمَا أَمَرْتُكُمْ بِهِ فَأْتُوا مِنْهُ مَا اسْتَطَعْتُمْ. Whatever I've ordered you to do as much of it as you can. Prohibition and order is the whole basis of how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala deals with us. He forbids us from doing certain things. He orders us to do certain things. That's how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala deals with us. His relationship with us is that He regulates our lives to better our lives. Once we move away from these orders and prohibitions, even though we may feel that we have freedom within our lives, the truth is that we lower the standard of our lives. But once we come into line with these divine prohibitions and orders, even though we may feel we're restricted, it's actually improving and bettering our lives. What's also worth noting here in the sequence, the Prophet ﷺ began with prohibition and then spoke about order. And that's the nature of the believer. Al-Ghazali, speaks about this, that you must stop yourself from committing haram before you can really engage with the orders. If somebody drinks alcohol, if somebody lies and somebody backbites, with all of that, and he doesn't even bother to try and stop that, just accepts that it's there. Even though you may struggle, or even though you may try and do the orders that Allah has required of you, you will always struggle with them. You want to become somebody who's firm in your worship, first eliminate the haram from your life. Get rid of the haram from your life first. Get rid of the foulness out of your life, the prohibited acts, and then you'll be able to progress with the divine orders. The term instruction, the word that the Prophet ﷺ he used here is وَمَا أَمَرْتُكُمْ بِهِ, whatever I have ordered you. That word amr, instruction, has many different meanings in the context of the Quran and the Sunnah. But the original meaning of the word order is something that you must do. Something that you're required to do. But this is at two levels. The same as prohibition, it's at two levels. There are certain things that you must do. If you didn't do them, you're responsible with your Lord. He'll hold you for not doing it. Just as there are certain prohibitions, if you don't do them, you're responsible, meaning you'll suffer the consequence either in this world or in the next world. There are certain things that you must do, but it's encouraged. You must do them in the sense it's advisable for you to do them. He still wants you to do them. It still falls under amr. That's something he requires you to do, but it's not to the same degree in that if you didn't do it, he's not going to hold you to account, he's not going to punish you. It's not considered to be a sinful act if you chose not to do it. So that the hadith where the Prophet ﷺ said, whatever I've ordered you to do as much of it as you are able, includes both necessary meaning those things that he ordered you to do, which if you didn't do them, he's going to punish you if you don't repent. And recommended those things where he told you to do them, but he's not going to hold you to account if you didn't do it. When the Prophet ﷺ said, do as much of it as you're able to, meaning extra or nawafil, the extra acts, because the obligatory acts, they're set, they're fixed. It's not do as much of it as you can. You're going to pray 5 times a day. You're going to fast one month a year. You're going to pay X amount of your wealth as zakah. You're going to do a set amount. So when the Prophet ﷺ spoke about do as much of it as you're able, he's talking about beyond the obligation. Ensure that you do what's required of you. Make sure you never miss anything that's required of you. Get your foundations in place. Then after that, then push yourself. But don't push yourself to breaking points. Push yourself, try and do more. It will increase you in your connection with your Lord. But do as much of it as you can. He didn't say that with prohibition. He didn't say stay away from as much of it as you can. He said stay away from it. He said avoid it. Prohibition is absolute, except for extreme hardship. Prohibition, you can never go to it. But orders, do the essentials, then after that just try as much as you can. So the necessary instruction, the amr, the order, which is of two types, one that's necessary that you have to do, one that's encouraged. The necessary one is that where if you didn't do it, there's a sin, there's a punishment, either in this world or in the next world. And some of the punishments will come in this world. Some of the punishments will come in this world. It may be physical punishments, but that's not our realm. We don't have authority over that. That's a Khalifa, that's a Muslim leader. But the punishment could be in the distance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that you experience. That you may choose not to pray. But that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala may well punish you because of that by opening up the doors for sin. Without you may not even get onto the fact that I missed that prayer because and during my day I did this haram, I did that haram, I struggled to do the next prayer, I may have even missed the second prayer. For many they wouldn't link the two together. I didn't pray my Fajr, therefore because of that I wasn't able to pray my Dhuhr. I wasn't able to pray my Asr. I ended up speaking with somebody and I spoke haram. It may well have been, usually often is because the beginning of the day you began with a sinful act. You did something that your Lord, and as a punishment, he just pushed you and opened up for you the path of sin. It made it easy for you. It made it easy for you to go down that path. سَنُيَسِّرُهُ لِلْعُسْرَى. That's what he subhanahu wa ta'ala says. وَأَمَّا مَنْ بَخِلَ وَاسْتَغْنَى وَكَذَّبَ بِالْحُسْنَى فَسَنُيَسِّرُهُ لِلْعُسْرَى. And the one who's tight and miserly, stingy with his money, and بَخِلَ وَاسْتَغْنَى, and thinks that he's free of his Lord, he doesn't need his Lord. وَكَذَّبَ بِالْحُسْنَى, and he denies goodness, he rejects goodness, we'll make it easy for him the path to difficulty. We'll open up for him the path to difficulty. The other one, and that's Abu Jahl, the other Abu Bakr said, يَسِّرُهُ لِلْيُسْرَى. And the one who believes, he's generous, he believes in his Lord, will make it easy for open up the paths of goodness for him. And what's the reward of doing a good deed? That Allah subhanahu lets you do another good deed after that. What's the punishment for committing a sinful act? That he pushes you down in that pathway. In the end you choose that, but he's opened up for you the doors to go further into sin. So the punishment for leaving a divine order will come in this world, unless you make tawbah, will come in this world, at the very least just by you becoming more distant from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The damage that it has on your heart, that's a punishment from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Like that dark mark, that darkness that descends on your heart, there's a mark that comes onto your heart. That's a ran, that's a rust that builds up on your heart. That's a consequence of that act of disobedience that you've committed with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that's the nature of a necessary order. And you're rewarded for doing the necessary order. Then we mention that this includes the obvious things, and these are usually the highest levels of obligation. And usually when we speak about fard, we're talking about those obligations that have been set in the Quran. That's usually what we're speaking about as fard, although there are others from the Sunnah as well. But often, particularly the highest level of fard, obligation, usually comes from the Quran. So the order to pray 5 times a day, the order to pay your zakah, that you must give a percentage of your wealth once a year, that comes from Allah. That's an order. Any of these are missing, then you have the consequence of punishment and sin. Perform the Hajj once a year, pilgrimage once a year. We're going to come on to the month of fasting, less than just over a month away. That obligation comes from Allah subhanahu in the Quran. The obligation to order good and forbid evil. It's an obligation upon the believers that when you see something wrong, you don't remain silent. And when you see people not doing what they're required, that you don't remain silent. We don't just say, it's that person's choice if they want to pray or not. Yes, it's their choice, but you should also advise people. If you see somebody doing wrong, yes, it's that person's choice, but you have a responsibility to correct people. And if that person wants to accept it or not, that's their choice. But at least you say something about it. You don't remain silent. The Prophet ﷺ likened that person who, when he sees wrong and remains silent, who has the ability to change it, he called him a shaitan akhras, a dumb devil, silent devil. Akhras, the one who can't speak. That's the nature. You see something wrong and you choose not to speak about it when you know full well that person probably will accept what you're saying. You just say it's his choice. He can do that or he doesn't have to. The Prophet likened you to a devil, a shaitan. Fulfilling your contracts. Whenever you give your word, it's an obligation that you meet your word. You give your word, Allah subhanahu gives that in the Quran. Awfu bil uqood. Fulfill your contracts. That's an order. That's an order. Once you've given your word, whether it's financial or more than that, you hold to your word, because your word is your honor in the sight of people. And so that's why Allah subhanahu has made binding upon you that you hold to your word, whether that person is a Muslim or not, makes no difference. Makes no difference. Whether that person is a Muslim or not, you're bound by your word. The Prophet ﷺ said, Al-Muslimuna inda shurutihim, that the Muslims are with the conditions. Meaning if they agree to a contract, they put some conditions, stipulate some conditions, then they must hold to that. They can't break their word. So that comes in the Quran. It's an obligation to spend on your family, to take care of the needs of your family, to put a roof over their head, to put food on the table for them. That's the obligation. These are all listed out because these are the highest levels of obligation. The highest level of obligation. If you were to fail with any of these, punishment would descend if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chooses not to forgive you. If you do these, you have the greatest reward with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Taking like for example the last one, because families, we have problems in terms of how we view our responsibility towards the family. Right? Spending on the family. If a man intentionally with the ability doesn't do so, he says she needs to go and work, I'm sitting at home, she goes and works, she's got to take care of her. He's responsible with his Lord for that. He's answerable to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But if he does that, he works a hard day at work and he's tired at the end of it, and he returns back home and there's food on the table because of that, the Prophet ﷺ said, provided he avoids sin, he returns back home at night and all his sins have been forgiven. All his sins, just because he's worked a hard day at work with the intention of providing for his family, he avoided haram there, he'll return back home with his sins with his sins forgiven. And the Prophet ﷺ spoke about dinar, like dinar is a gold coin, like a pound. Now, so he said a pound that you give in charity, a pound that you spend to free a slave, a pound that you spend on your family. He said the best with Allah is the one that you spend on your family. The best with Allah is the one that you spend on your family. That bucket going around every Friday and you're throwing money in there, better you spend it at home. Better, although that's rewarded, there's no doubt, but the highest obligation is not just to spend on the mosque. That's not an obligation, that's great reward. The highest obligation is to put food on the table for your family, to pay your rent, to pay your bills with your family. Every time you're going out, you complain about paying the rent. Remember, that's one of the best things you can do for your family. One of the best things you can do for your family. So here, to highlight the other side, which is, if you fail that, you're sinful, but the other side, every time you do this, you have great reward with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. All of these acts have been required by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the believer is required to carry out all these acts and cannot be negligent in doing any of these acts. He may be excused that anything that's fard, that's obligatory. The Prophet ﷺ said, whatever I've ordered you to do as much of it as you can. So you must do it. You must do it. There's no two ways about it. You must do it. Don't make excuses. But there are certain cases where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala excuse you from doing it. Because in principle, Qasim is the usuli now. The principle is that an obligation remains upon you until you performed it, or the one who set it upon you has lifted the obligation from you. And if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has told you to do something, you must do it. If you've done it, you fulfilled. Or if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you don't need to do it. Or if He excuses you from doing it, then there's no further requirements. Like if certain conditions are not met, or something's prevented performance of the act. Like certain conditions could be, for example, in prayer, that you don't have the ability to purify yourself. No water to do wudu, no soil to clean yourself, then you're exempted from prayer. There's no requirements of prayer. Conditions is like a sick person who's paralyzed, he can't move, there's no prayer required of him. Person's paralyzed, he can't even move his head. He can't even nod his head for ruku and sujood, he's not required to pray anymore. He'll have to make them up. If they're less than 5 prayers, he'll have to make them up, but he's not required to pray at that particular point. The one who set upon him the prayer has lifted the requirement from him at that point. Something prevented performance of the act for a woman. Once every month, she's not able to, because Allah has put something that stops her from praying once every month. At that point, Allah has lifted the obligation. So in certain cases, conditions are not met. Certain cases, there's something that comes that stops that person from performing the act. As long as those are not in place, the Prophet ﷺ said, whatever I've ordered you to do as much of it as you can. Then you have the second type of order, a recommended instruction. And that's again something that Allah subhanahu, the Messenger ﷺ required you to do, but not to the same level. Not to the same level means that if you did it, you'll get reward, but always remember that the reward of a nafil act never matches up to the fard act. It never matches up to the fard act. You could pray tahajjud all night long. You missed that fajr, that tahajjud was wasted. That was wasted. You prayed all night long, you slept through your fajr. It would be better that you slept and woke up for fajr. Because nothing will match to the obligatory act. You give sadaqah all the time. Charity every Friday you're giving it, but you don't know how to pay your zakah. You don't know when you're required to pay it. You don't know what you're required to pay it on, then all that sadaqah is wasted. All that charity is wasted. A nafil act will never match up to a fard act. The blessings of the nafil is as long as the fard is being done properly. If the fard is being done, your foundations are in place, then you can start building on top of it. Then the extra acts have worth and value, because the nafil draws you closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? You start moving on your journey to your Lord by doing what? The Prophet said, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, that my slave draws near to me with nothing more beloved to me than the obligatory acts. The fard have to be in place first. Then he will carry on drawing near to me through the nafil, the optional acts. The obligatory acts must be in place first. So however great, if a person wants to do such an act, he's rewarded, but the reward will never match the reward of a fard. But, and this is the key difference, with an obligatory act that's required of you, like the 5 daily prayers, if you intentionally miss them, a major sin. The optional acts, if you intentionally miss them, there's nothing against you. You just missed an opportunity, a chance to get a lot of reward. Now you prayed your Maghrib. You prayed your Maghrib. You've got great reward by praying it. And greater reward because you prayed in Jama'ah. But you may not have prayed the Sunnah and the Nafil after. That's not as significant. It's important that you pray it, because Allah, the Prophet ﷺ prayed it. He told you to pray it. He told you to pray 6 after, because he ﷺ did it as well, awabin. So there's great reward in all of these, but if you chose not to do it, nobody can tell you that you are wrong, because Allah subhanahu has not told you that you are wrong. So you want to do the extra acts, but you should always remember that the cornerstone of your religion is the fard. It's not the nafil. The nafil are like the bonuses that you get from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then, as examples, it said, this includes the sunnahs that are prayed with the fard prayers. These are also required, but not to the same degree. Spending generously on the family. Allah requires you to spend on the family. If you now spend more on your family, beyond what you're required, you are rewarded for doing that. But it's not obligatory. It's not obligatory upon you. But at the same time, you should remember that you should not go to excesses with your family, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about the general obligation of spending. He describes not going to extremes, either two extremes. He says, those who when they spend, لم يسرفوا ولم يقتروا وكان بين ذلك قواما. Those who when they spend, they don't go to extremes. They're not extravagant. They're not lavish. Every time they go and buy something, they buy the most expensive that they don't even need. وَلَمْ يَقْتُرُوا. Nor are they tight. They're not lavish, they're not extravagant, but they're not tight with their money. وَكَانَ بَيْنَ ذَلِكَ قَوَامًا. They're in between. So it's good to go that bit beyond what you're required to, and it's rewarded. Being charitable, recording loans, eating with the right hand, and so on. Recording loans is mentioned. That's an example that's mentioned because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states in the Quran that whenever you lend money, Allah فَلْيَكْتُبْ بَيْنَكُمْ كَاتِبٌ بِالْعَدْلِ, said that a scribe should record it. Whenever you loan somebody money it should be recorded. It should be a written contract to confirm it. And it comes as an order in the Quran, as an instruction. And the ayah states whether the amount is small or large. Just imagine somebody comes who wants to lend a tenner from you. So let's write it down. They'll laugh at you, right? They'll laugh at you. But even now, if a large amount, even then people are just not used to the idea. Somebody wants to borrow like 10,000 from you, let's record it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said record it whether it's a large amount or a small amount. Record it if it's a large amount. The fuqaha, pretty much all of them stated their order there is recommended. But here, to remove any disputes, to remove any arguments about the money so people don't fall out over money later on, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala suggests it's a good thing, just write it down. Just have a record of it. And it's interesting, when you reflect over the Quran, the longest ayah in the Quran is about debts that people owe. It's how you keep track of debts. The longest ayah in the Quran is exactly about this. So it's known as Ayatul Mudayana. It's the verse of lending money. The whole ayah speaks about not transaction, it's just loaning money. What's the best way of doing it. All of it is recommended, but Allah has given instructions in there just for the betterment of how you to do it, because most people tend to fall out over money. People always tend to fall out over money, so Allah has given you the best way of dealing with it. Wallahu a'lam. So that's the idea behind order. There are more points to take out of this hadith, which we'll discuss in our next session, which will be in 3 weeks' time, which will be the last one before Ramadan, bi-idhnillahi ta'ala.